All right, thank you so much for that excellent introduction. I feel like much of my talk is going to be overview because it seems like there's such a knowledgeable base of folks here. So if there are questions, yeah, feel free to raise your hand. Otherwise, I think we'll have plenty of time at the end for questions too. So I'm also planning on sticking around. So if you can't get your question in during the talk or right afterwards, I'll be around for questions after the talk throughout the meeting. So all right, let's get into it. I'm going to cover kind of two big topics. Briefly go over native aquatic plant identification, very briefly, and then dive into Eurasian Watermilfoil, identification, impacts, management, do's and don'ts about when and if you find it. It's good to know that there's already been some management efforts that have been going on, so this might be, hopefully this will kind of interplay with that and add to the information that you already have. Okay. So I always like to start by talking about just aquatic plants in general, right? These are beneficial for our water bodies. They provide food and habitat for birds, amphibians, fish, invertebrates, things that those birds and fish eat. So they also help reduce algae in our water bodies. So we know Pattison Lake has some algae issues as well as other lakes nearby. So those aquatic plants help keep the algae down. They also stabilize shorelines and regulate water nutrients and chemistry. And again, as most folks are probably aware, this is what can happen when you get an invasive plant in your lake. So on the photo on the left here, or the cartoon on the left here, is of a diverse native plant community. We have many different types of species, and that's going to support a diverse wildlife community, invertebrates, fish. Whereas the picture on the right here is what you get sometimes when you get an invasive species that comes in. You'll get a monotypic community where there's just one or a few species, and that won't support as many fish and wildlife species. So that's not the situation that we want to get to in Pattison Lake. All right, I'm just going to do a quick rundown of aquatic plant identification, highlighting some of our native species before we get into the deep dive on Eurasian Watermilfoil. Okay, so I'd like to start by just talking about the different growth forms of aquatic plants. So folks are probably familiar with this. So we have our emergent plants, those that kind of just have their feet wet at the edge. So these would be like our cattails, our bulrushes, our sedges. Then as we get deeper into the water, we get our floating leaf plants, our fragrant water lilies, our yellow pond lilies. And then finally we get to our submerged plants. So this would be what our water milfoil, our pondweeds, the plants that are fully submerged in the water. So again, just some examples of these emergent plants. I'm not going to go into these, but folks are familiar with cattails or arrowhead with its arrow-shaped leaves, water plantain, sedges, rushes. And then we have our floating leaf plants. So again, most folks are familiar with our water lilies that are on the lake. These are not going to have any submerged leaves. So right, they're going to come from an underground rhizome. They're going to have a leaf stalk, and then they're going to be leaves that are floating on the surface. So if you come across a plant that maybe has a floating leaf but also has some submerged leaves, it's probably something else, and I'll get into what that species might be, or what those species might be soon here. So again, we have a couple native species that are floating leaf plants, as well as one predominant invasive one. So our invasive is the fragrant water lily. Again, most folks are probably familiar with that on Pattison Lake. It's got that stereotypical, very pretty, fragrant white flower, those round leaves with the leaf notch. But we also have our native yellow pond lily, also called spatterdock, Rocky Mountain pond lily, a couple common names for that one. And that's going to be a yellow flower and a more triangular shaped leaf. Still have that leaf notch, but again, much more triangular shaped. One that I'm not sure if y'all have on Pattison Lake, but it's in lakes nearby, is one called water shield. That's another native one. And this will kind of demonstrate how those leaf types look. So right, we have our fragrant water lily, round leaves with the leaf notch. We get our yellow pond lily, much more triangular leaves, still that leaf notch. And then our water shield, where actually the stem of the leaf is right underneath the center of that leaf, no leaf notch. So just to get you an idea, if you're out there, you see these plants, what you might be encountering. Also very distinct flowers, but you don't often see the flowers. As you know, with many of our aquatic plants, you'll just see those leaves. So this will just help cue you into what you might be seeing out on the lake. All right, just a quick detour into our free-floating plants. So folks might be familiar with duckweed or heard that term before. So these plants are not rooted in the sediment. They're freely floating on the water surface. Sometimes they have really minuscule roots that hang down into the water, and that's where they're getting their nutrients from, just in the water column. I think these plants are really fascinating. There's a lot of diversity in them. Again, folks are familiar with probably duckweed, which is Lemna is the genus name. But we also have greater duckweed, Wolfia, and star duckweed. And all these are found throughout Thurston County. They very well might be on Pattison Lake as well. So if you encounter some of these little floating guys, they could be one of these species here. Most of these are native. There's none that we're aware of that are invasive or problematic. All right, I know we're moving quickly, but we're gonna go right into our submerged aquatic plants. And I wanna start with some kind of unique ones, two of which, these are actually fully unrooted. So there's bladderworts and coontail. They actually don't produce roots down in the sediment. They just freely float through the water column. Sometimes they'll sink down onto the sediment. So, you know, during your aquatic plant surveys, you might pull up a bunch of coontail, which is this one down here on the right. But it's actually not anchored to the sediment in any way. Bladderworts, folks might be familiar with, these are actually carnivorous plants. They have small bladders on the leaves that actually suck in aquatic invertebrates and sometimes algae as well, and they digest them to get their nutrients. So really fascinating plants. And these are both found on Pattison Lake, so, and many lakes nearby. All right, now really the meat of the native plants here is our submerged aquatic plants, so those that are fully in the water. So this is your milfoils, your pondweeds, your naiads, water weeds. There's a whole bunch of them. I'm gonna go through a couple of these, and then we're gonna end up on the milfoils where we'll go a little bit deeper. All right, let's start with our pondweeds. These guys are mostly friends, right? The only non-native one that we have in Washington is curly-leaf pondweed, which we know we have on Long Lake. It's a pretty common invasive plant. That's this one down here, kind of bottom center right there. But we have about 20 other native pondweed species. These are great native species. They provide really excellent habitat for our native fish and other water creatures. Some keys to identifying these. So they're gonna have what we call alternating leaf structure. So you can really see it on some of these figures. Every time a leaf attaches to the stem, there's just gonna be one leaf that's coming off there as opposed to two or more, like our milfoils or some of our other aquatic plants. Also, those leaves are gonna be whole. It's just gonna be like a leaf on a tree that you might see. It's a whole entire leaf. It's not dissected or anything like that. You know, aside, you have things like the curly-leaf pondweed, which have, you know, that kind of unique kind of lasagna noodle structure, but otherwise that leaf is entire, it's whole. They often produce flower spikes that are going to be above the water surface. So sometimes you'll see that, especially with this one here, our large-leaf pondweed. And then sometimes they produce floating leaves as well. So you have this kind of waxy floating leaf that's up there. And again, I mentioned earlier, our pond lilies and those are only going to produce floating leaves, whereas our pondweeds will produce both floating leaves and fully submerged leaves. So if you see something floating at the surface, pick that up. If you see leaves underneath, it's probably one of our native pondweeds. Okay, naiad, sometimes called water nymph. Again, fairly common here in Thurston County. There's a couple of different species. You don't need to be too worried about which individual species they are. There's none that we know that are invasive. They're all native. But you can see how on the surface this might look pretty similar to our pondweeds, right? It's got some similar structure, but a key here is that this is actually going to have opposite leaves. So at each point where the leaf attaches, you're going to have two leaves that are coming off from that stem, right? Not just one like you would with the pondweeds. The leaves are often going to be much smaller than pondweed leaves, so which makes these kind of a stringy appearance in the water. Sometimes they can grow in these dense mats, which can be a nuisance too. But the other thing to take note is these aren't going to produce any floating leaves, and they're not going to produce any flowering stalks above the water surface. So that's another thing. If you see that flower stalk or those floating leaves, you can rule out that it's a naiad. Okay, water weeds. Again, another familiar, very common one that we have throughout Thurston County, throughout the state. These are also going to have a really stringy appearance, but the key with this one is that it's going to have leaves in whorls of 3. So every time a leaf attaches to that stem, you're going to have 3 leaves that are going to be there. There is an invasive Elodea, or Brazilian Elodea, which folks might be familiar with. We've actually found it relatively recently on Long Lake. And I'm going to show some pictures of that to help you distinguish those two. So if you find something that looks similar, you'll hopefully be able to distinguish those. So again, our native water weeds, leaves in whorls of 3, stringy. Those leaves are going to be pretty small too. You can see it's kind of tough to gauge, but you got that pencil up there, just how large those plants are, those leaves, pretty small. Again, this can actually grow pretty dense. Sometimes it causes problems in some lakes, shallow areas, canals, things like that. But for the most part, this is a friendly native plant. Okay, difference though, Brazilian waterweed. It's got a couple other common names, Brazilian elodea. Some folks just call it Aegaria, which is its scientific name. This one's actually not native here. It's native to South America. It's been brought in through the aquarium trade. Sometimes it was used in classrooms, things like that. It's been in Washington for a long time. Some lakes have had it for a very long time. There's a long lake in Kitsap County, which has had it since probably before the 70s. It's a Class B noxious weed. It's still regulated here in Thurston County, so it's required for eradication. Like I said, they found, well, I found, or refound a population that they had found a couple years back in Long Lake. We've discovered some more there, unfortunately, but Thurston County Noxious Weed Program is working on trying to eradicate those plants there. But this is something definitely to keep an eye out for, knowing how close Pattison Lake is to Long Lake. The key to differentiating this from our natives is that this is going to have whorls of 4 leaves. So our native is going to have whorls of 3. This one's going to have whorls of 4. And I got a couple photos up-close photos that will help us see that a little more closely. So, okay, here we go. So we got our Brazilian waterweed on the left there, our native on the right. You can see it's a much bigger plant. Those leaves are going to be much more robust. And then the leaves, there we go, our native versus Brazilian, much larger. Now, you don't always have them side by side to compare, but it's something that if you are interested, as you get more familiar with it, you'll really be able to tell that difference between those two plants. Just kind of if you compare the length of those leaves to how thick the stem is, much longer leaves, and those whorls of 4 for the Brazilian. Again, something, I didn't want to take too much time on this, but I really wanted to bring it up to this group because it's something that's nearby, and it's really tough to get rid of, arguably tougher than Eurasian Watermilfoil to get rid of in your lake. So I'm not trying, it's okay, everyone's going to be fine. It's not going to get here. Just some more photos here. But just, prevention is the key, right? That's the big thing. So just being aware what this looks like, certainly if you catch it early, you can get rid of it. So another just couple examples of what those two look like kind of side by side. Okay, a couple other species I want to mention. These are called stoneworts. They're actually algae that look very similar to our regular aquatic plants. So they're not vascular plants. They don't have vascular tissue to send up the water and nutrients, but they look just like our normal aquatic plants. There's 2 really common genera here in Washington, Cara and Nitella. Folks might know this as muskgrass. It's got a really skunky odor, so if you're ever pull up something on your fishing line, or if you're out doing a plant survey and you pull up a big mass of something and it's got a real skunky odor, it very well could be muskgrass. Some people pronounce it chara, I pronounce it cara, same thing. Really interesting ancient lineage of plants. It produces these reproductive structures here that will actually fossilize, and they found these like millions of years old in some ancient lake beds, so really interesting. The Nitella, which I don't have a picture of here, won't have that skunky odor, but it'll have a very similar structure. I know Jane and the folks that have been doing the surveys, they found some of these plants and sent me some photos, so they could probably tell you some more about it, or I could talk more about them later too, but really interesting ones. Sometimes they'll form these carpets at the bottom of the lake, and they can grow in some deeper water as well. So sometimes once you're out past your pondweeds and things like that into the deeper waters, these will kind of carpet those deeper waters of the lake. Okay, which brings us to watermilfoils. I know I'm moving faster, but I wanted to spend a lot of time on these species. So in general, watermilfoils, they're going to have a column-like shape in the water column. They're sometimes going to be highly branched. Like our Eurasian watermilfoil, we know it has many branches. Here's a couple examples here of that branching. They're going to have feather-like leaves. So in contrast to our pondweeds and other aquatic plants, we're going to have these examples show it really nicely, a central stalk and then segments that are coming off from that central stalk. So it's going to look like a feather, a little feather. Typically, you're going to have a whorl of 4 of those leaves. So this whole thing is one leaf divided into segments, and you'll have 4 of those on each part of the stem where leaves attach. They often If they flower, will produce a flower stalk above the water surface, so you'll see a little spike a couple inches tall above the water surface producing the flowers, and I'll have some photos of that. Yeah, I think that covers most things. So that's just water milfoils in general, right? And we actually have about 10 different species here in Washington. So I'm going to cue you in on some things to differentiate Eurasian water milfoil from some of our natives, including the one that we know we have in Pattison Lake. Okay, so I'm going to go over just general water milfoils in Washington. This might be a little too in-depth, but this stuff gets me really excited, so I'm just going to go for it. All right, 9 total species in Washington state. If you remember way back from your science classes, this is what's called a phylogenetic tree. I wanted to show this to you so you can see how closely related some of these species are, and that's important for things like hybridization and telling the species apart. So basically, species that are closer to each other in this tree are more closely related. If you're further apart, you're more distantly related. So okay, we have 6 native species, which are in blue, and these are the scientific names. I'll explain the common names for everyone here, and 3 introduced that are in red. So a couple I'll point out. I feel like I like using my hands better. So this is Eurasian water milfoil right here, Myriophyllum spicatum. This is northern water milfoil right here, one of our natives. You can see how closely those are related. There's only basically one link in between them. They're sister species. Whereas something like, I'll go back to my pointer here, so this group, whereas this group here, they're all really closely related, but pretty distantly related to our Eurasian and northern water milfoil. Similarly to these species down here, this is the other one we know of, we have on Pattison Lake, world water milfoil, or Myriophyllum verticillum. And then you got some other oddballs here. This is another one that's pretty rare. So you don't need to worry about all of these, right? But again, just kind of wanted to give you just, there's a lot of variation and variability, 6 native, 3 introduced. What we also know is that those, they can hybridize with each other, right? So we have a couple situations where our natives have hybridized with the invasive strains. So both for our Eurasian and northern water milfoil, they can hybridize because they're so closely related. And then up top there, we have variable leaf water milfoil, which is that heterophyllum, with our native western water milfoil, Hipporoides. I want to say probably don't worry too much about that hybrid group. We do have some variable leaf water milfoil in Thurston County, not close by here. It's pretty isolated, so probably not one you need to worry about too much. There are some other parts of the state where those two occur together and are hybridizing, but don't stress too much about those. The Eurasian and northern water milfoil hybrids, though, are much more common. And oftentimes, when someone sends me a photo of a plant that looks like Eurasian water milfoil, sometimes it'll have these intermediate traits, and they actually turn out to be hybrids, which are just as aggressive, sometimes even more so than just the pure Eurasian water milfoil. So I usually think of them as the same. We'd want to manage them the same way. We want to make sure we're preventing their spread the same way as you would pure Eurasian water milfoil. The other thing, again, I want to point out is this, again, this is our world water milfoil. We know we have populations of that on Pattison Lake, but I want to let folks know it's pretty distantly related to Eurasian water milfoil. It's highly unlikely that those would ever hybridize. So in a way, if you had northern here, I'd be like, ooh, it could be messy, but you have these two that are pretty distant related. So hybridization is likely not going to be occurring between these two species. Okay. So let's just focus on Eurasian water milfoil for a little bit here. Native to Europe, Asia, and Africa. It's been in Washington for a long time, since at least the 1960s. It's been in the US for at least the 1940s, maybe even early 1900s. Very long time. For a long time, they couldn't actually distinguish them between our native northern water milfoil, and so it became a big mess. So we're not even sure when it came here and how long it's been here. But we're much better at identifying them now and through genetics and other means. So it's a Class B noxious weed in Washington, which means in some parts of the states it's required to be controlled. In other parts, like Thurston County, it's not actually required to be controlled. It's not regulated essentially here, and that's because unfortunately it's relatively common in Thurston County. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't be controlling it when we can, though. All right, negative impacts. Paul did a great job of explaining some of these already. So, right, its main mechanism of action is that it's going to get up to the surface and spread out on the surface, right? Which is bad for recreation, swimming, boating, fishing, all those things, but also bad for our native plants and native aquatic wildlife, right? It's shading out those native plants. It creates conditions in the water column, higher temperatures, affects dissolved oxygen. It just kind of really mucks up the system. It spreads really readily by fragmentation, so it's really good at spreading, right? It can actually produce flowers and seeds, but its main mode is that it self-fragments, so it actually just fragments on its own. Those fragments can all produce new plants. And those are actually, again, I'm sounding really doom and gloom. It's all right, but those actually are more able to germinate better than just if you were to chop it up in your boat motor. So it's set up in a way to spread really easily. And as I mentioned, it hybridizes with one of our native species. So we found, unfortunately, here in Washington, other states where basically through hybridization, it's making those native species less common because it's swamping out that gene pool. So really something, again, that we want to act aggressively on to try to get rid of and stop it from continuing to spread. As I mentioned with recreation, it forms these surface mats. It's not good to drive your boat through, and those can also help fragment the plant too, unfortunately, when you're taking your boat through or recreating through those. Okay, wow, all right, I'm gonna pick up the pace here. So a couple things for ID. Again, its ability to spread on the surface is definitely a cue. None of our other native milfoils are gonna spread out on the surface quite as much. The leaves will often be limp when you pull them out of water. Stems will sometimes be pink or red. Oftentimes the leaves will have this kind of flattened tip up at the top, so these two are Eurasian Watermilfoil. The other thing is the number of leaflets or leaf segments, so that's the little segments here. If it's 24 or more, I know it's tough to count those sometimes, that's going to cue you in that it's very likely Eurasian Watermilfoil. Our natives are not going to have as many segments as Eurasian Watermilfoil. They're also going to be just really regularly shaped, right? So you can tell between this is the northern and the Eurasian, it's really regular, where the northern is a little bit more diffuse. Doesn't have that regular segmentation. In terms of reproduction, this is a Eurasian Watermilfoil flower, really tiny. This is the flower spike above the water surface, and these are each individual flowers, little puffy pink structures there. And you'll notice it's not going to have anything below these flowers, whereas some of the other natives will actually have little leaves underneath those flowers, so that will cue you in. And I wanted to point out these two species here. So yeah, we have our Eurasian Watermilfoil, and this is our world watermilfoil. This is the one that we know we have on Pattison Lake. And you can already kind of see some differences once you start looking a little closely. So one big thing is you got that kind of pinkish reddish stem on the Eurasian Watermilfoil. You're also going to have more space in between each one of those whorls of leaves. So it's kind of a lankier looking plant than our world watermilfoil. That has a much smaller space in between those leaves. I also have these cross sections of the leaves themselves. So you can see at each point where there's a leaf, there's going to be four leaves. 1, 2, 3, 4. And for the world watermilfoil, it's going to be much more diffuse. There's going to be fewer leaflets, and it's not going to be as regular and as finely segmented as the Eurasian Watermilfoil. Now, the easiest way to tell them apart is actually through their flowers. They don't always flower. Ooh, I'll mention this too. If you find a structure like this on the milfoil, this is a turion. Eurasian Watermilfoil will not produce these. If you find something like that, it cues you in that this is our world watermilfoil. So this is actually an overwintering structure that these produce. So those will hang out, produce a new plant the next season. Now flowers. Okay, Eurasian Watermilfoil flowers. Again, oftentimes pink, can sometimes be cream colored or even darker like purple. This is what the world watermilfoil flowers will look like. And it doesn't always flower, but when it does, you can kind of see it's larger, it's more green. The fruits are going to be much rounder. And then this picture will actually show it a little bit better too. It will actually have these little leaves underneath the flowers and fruits. Little segmented leaves, almost look like mini Christmas trees. So it's really neat. And if you see this more, you'll kind of cue in on, okay, this is the difference. So that's what you would want to look for if you're seeing a flower stalk above the water surface. Is there little tiny leaves underneath those flowers, or does it just look like a naked stalk of a naked flower stalk? Again, just world watermilfoil there, Eurasian Watermilfoil there. So usually I've seen them flower really July through, gosh, I was just out on a lake on the other side of the state. It was early October. So sometimes you can have multiple peaks in the flowering season. But yeah, I'd say as soon as July, sometimes even a little earlier, and that can extend, yeah, through October. See another question there, yeah?
You said that there's snowfall fragments,
Mm-hmm.
and it gets on boat motors?
Yep.
Is that just a nuisance to the motor, or do they spread it?
It's both. So yeah, that can, I didn't have the photo. I had a really nice photo of, I often use just like a little Minn Kota trolling motor on a John boat, right? And that thing can get so chalked up with milfoil. So it is a nuisance to your boat motor, but then yes, also those fragments, if you're just, let's say, going to another lake, even a half hour away, they can stay alive on your boat for that, even longer and resprout and form a new plant. So yeah. Alrighty. Okay, the other thing we know, at least from my knowledge, when I've done one survey in Pattison Lake a couple years back, at least we know that there's a population of world water milfoil near this railroad trestle. So that's another thing to cue you in. From what I understand, the Eurasian is not in this area. Is that safe to say? Okay. So that's another thing to cue you in. If you're in this area, that's probably what you got there. Yes?
Is it on both sides of the trestle? Both sides, north, south, lake?
I'm not sure. What's that?
To the north.
To the north? Okay. Okay. I know the one time I was out here, I didn't make it to the other side. We were short on time. And I did see some to the south, but that was, these populations can shift a little bit too. So, but that's good to know. That's
It was mostly right in the channel on the north side.
okay. Okay, great. Okay. All right. I'm at least going to get through prevention. I have some slides on management. I want to make sure we have enough time for the other stuff. So I at least want to cover prevention here really quick. And then maybe we can take some questions. So these are recommended things to not do. I realize that y'all have a kind of coordinated response. So before I knew what the response was, these are just some ideas I thought about things you might not want to do. And these are things to, let's say if you're just out on your boat and you see a plant, the first thing that I put is don't just try to attempt to pull that plant up out of the ground, right, from your boat. Because what you could do is you could fragment that plant. So only do that if you're doing it part of a coordinated effort, right? If you have some other folks around that can collect fragments, or you're in the water diving. So oftentimes it's tempting, right, to just yank that plant out, but you're going to leave some of that plant down in the water and you might fragment it. This is especially true after herbicide treatments. They can make that plant really delicate, and if you're just grabbing it, you could create more fragments. So that's one maybe don't do. The other thing is if you can avoid it, don't drive your boats right through the plants, right, because you're going to create fragments and also potentially bring those on your boat. The other thing I would caution against is I know y'all are doing your rake sampling throughout the water body. This might be an area you want to avoid where there's Eurasian watermilfoil to avoid fragmentation. If you can, the other thing is if you are going to use that method, you just want to make sure maybe you grab any fragments that might come up using that method, just to be aware of. Okay, things you should do though, right? If you find plants, document it, right? Let the LMD, let the Lake Association know where you found it. Even if, a lot of times with our smartphones, right, if you just take a photo, it ought to be geotagged, so you can share that with someone. You can take a coordinate. Anything to figure out where that distribution is when you see it, and to let folks know as soon as you can is important. So that's certainly a do. Coordinate with the Lake Association. The other thing that is like kind of an easy thing you could do if you're really tempted to control the plants is you can use something that's called like a bottom barrier or a benthic barrier. So this is actually just like a fabric. You could use burlap. I know lots of other lakes have used this. You can basically cut it to a certain size and actually place it on the bottom to actually like shade out the plant. Again, that's something you all should coordinate on if that's what you're a method you want to use, but sometimes that's really good for just a really small patch. Again, you would need to get into the water to place that. You could stake it down, you could set rocks down, but that is a method that you could use that's kind of better than just yanking the plant out of the ground. So that's just a method I wanted to throw in there. Okay, fragments. There we go. If you see a fragment floating in the water, on your boat, on the shore, really the best thing to do is throw it in the trash. That's the safest thing you can do. If you feel like you can securely take it up to a place where it won't go back into the water body, that's okay too. You can use it for compost. There's lots of different things you could do with it. The big thing is just to not let it get back into the water body, right? So oftentimes for me, if I find fragments, I keep a trash bag with me. They just go right in the trash. That's the safest thing to do. Okay, and this is just general. I kind of end every talk like this. I'm not going to go into the management stuff that I had, but if we do have time or folks are interested, I can go into some of that. But This is just the big mantra, right? Clean, drain, dry. So anytime you're bringing your boat, yourself, your stand-up paddleboard, whatever it is, out of the water body, clean it off, spray it down, wipe it down, remove any noticeable plant fragments, mud, anything like that from your watercraft, from yourself, from your boots. If there's water in your boat, in your bilge, get that out of there. And that's not so much necessarily for aquatic plants, but things like New Zealand mud snails or zebra quagga mussels, which hopefully will never come to Washington, but they could be here. So, and then to the best extent you can, dry out your gear, dry out your boat. If you can leave it out for a couple of days, great. If you're going to another water body, you can wipe it down. Just try to get as much of that water and muck off your boat, out of your boat as you can. Okay, again, I think maybe we'll just have some questions. So I'm going to just skip through the end here. Yeah, there we go. Oh, extra slides. Okay, so yeah, I want to make sure we have enough time for questions. I do have some management information. I could go into that if we wanted to, but it seems like you guys have a good plan already. So.
That'd be good to go into.
Yeah, okay. Let's do it. So what I'll do is I'll take the rest of the next 5 minutes and go over this, and then I'll be around for questions afterwards. So great. Oh boy. Okay, let's see if this looks better when I go back through it the right way. Okay. There we go. So I'll just throw all these up here. We'll just go through it. So a couple different ways, right, that you can manage any aquatic plant, including Eurasian Watermilfoil. The first being physical management. So this is anything from digging down with your hands, a shovel, to using heavy equipment like a harvester, right? So I wanted to highlight a couple of these that are better for early infestations and those that are probably not as good for early infestations. So you kind of have the sliding scale of selective to non-selective. So the top three that I highlighted here are things like hand pulling. Again, if you're in the water, it's a coordinated effort. You're making sure you're getting any fragments. That can be really effective. Another that I mentioned here is something called diver-assisted suction harvesting. There's a couple companies that will do this. You're basically just hand pulling, but you're also feeding it basically into a suction tube that brings the plants up onto the boat. And it's a way that you can remove lots of aquatic plants or lots of Eurasian Watermilfoil kind of quickly. So it's kind of a hand pull method. The other is, like I mentioned, bottom barriers. It sounds like given the acreage that you'll have, this might not be the best approach, but for small patches, it can be really effective. Essentially, you're just shading out the plants. Things that might be less effective for early infestation, raking up plants, right? If you're on Lake Washington and it's Eurasian Watermilfoil everywhere, sure, rake up those plants around your dock. They're already spread here. I would not recommend that here because you could fragment up the plants. There's things like mechanical harvesting and mowing, rotovation, where you're actually like churning up the bottom sediment and getting the roots, bottom dredging, and then a drastic measure like a drawdown. I don't think any of those are probably what you'd be looking at to do here, but I just want to mention they're methods that folks use depending on the situation. And you can take measures into your own hands. I'm not sure if folks are familiar with the Aquatic Plants and Fish pamphlet. This is actually, it's a permit that you can just print out online through WDFW. And as long as you have that permit in hand or even up on your phone, you can actually do some of this management yourself. You can go hand pull, you can rake, you can put down bottom barriers. I had a copy of this. I'd be happy to show people, but you can find it online if you just Google WDFW Aquatic Plants and Fish pamphlet. It's basically just a fast track way so you don't have to get what they call like a hydraulic project approval, which would take a lot of steps. It just lets you do some work on your own that's pretty minimal. And it lets you do more work for things like Eurasian Watermilfoil and actual listed noxious weeds. It's much more limited for getting rid of native plants that might be a nuisance. Okay, chemical, very briefly. So it sounds like y'all are already working with aquatechnics. They know their stuff probably definitely better than I do. And obviously the big thing is just making sure that you have permit coverage, which Pattison Lake does have permit coverage, along with the other lakes that are covered under LMDs in Thurston County. And importantly, for folks who might not be aware, some folks think, okay, they get a little worried about chemicals, but any chemical that's going to be used in Washington State is specially approved. It's a restricted use chemical for aquatic use, right? It's been covered by the EPA to be safe in aquatic environments. So they're not going to be just dumping anything into the lake. These are all approved aquatic herbicides. I'm going to go through this quite quickly. I imagine, yes, as you mentioned, so this one with a long name, that's third down, fluoroperoxybenzoyl, that's Procelicor. So this is a list of herbicides that have been listed as excellent and good by Army Corps of Engineers testing. And importantly, I'm going to just scroll through this. Oops. Oh, my fish didn't show up where I wanted it to be. I wanted to show this because there's lots of considerations about which chemical to use. Again, your companies like Aquatic, a lot of the other ones, they're very familiar with these products. They've been using them for decades. And, oh man, yeah, they didn't all show up where I wanted it to. Procelicor, fluoroperoxybenzoyl, is actually a really good product because it's very safe, low toxicity. That fish should not be showing up there because it doesn't actually have any fish impacts. It's really safe for people and wildlife, so it's a good product. Now, there's some other ones that could be used too. So what my symbols mean, we have contact herbicide is labeled with a C, it's an orange. Products that are more selective, I've highlighted in green, and ones that potentially have fish impacts, I got my little fish symbol, but it's kind of moved around a little bit, so apologize for that. But again, just to show you that there's many considerations that are being taken into place about which product to use. And even those with fish impacts, basically that just means it's subject to a certain fish timing window where it would be applied when it's not going to impact juvenile fish. So they're still safe to use, just at the appropriate time. Again, it sounds like you guys are using probably the best chemical that's on the market. It's very specific to water milfoils. I'm sure that's probably been explained to you. So one thing that is good is that it seems like the population of Eurasian water milfoil is not close to the native world water milfoil. If they were intermingled, that could be problematic, right? Because you could be impacting your native water milfoil species. So just something to keep in mind. The other thing to keep in mind is some of these products, if you use the same one again and again, you might have diminishing returns. So you want to sometimes mix it up, use a slightly different chemical if you're treating year after year. So yeah. I think that does legitimately take me to the end. So hey, we're at 7:45. So I don't know if we have time for questions. Otherwise, I'm happy to stick around. I really appreciate y'all bringing me here and letting me share what I know with you. And yeah, I really appreciate it.
Check my notes.
Yeah.
Yeah, you could take about 10 minutes for questions if you want. Sure. Okay. We'll do questions for 10 minutes with Wes. If you have questions for him, now's your time.
No questions is okay too.
I've got one. When we sent you the samples, you were going to do genetic testing or send out for genetic testing?
Yep.
Do you have any results yet?
I don't. I've been in contact with the lab. They've been a little slow to get back to me. They're preserved. They have yet to be sent to the lab, but as soon as I do and I know a result, I'll let you know. I think I'm probably 95% confident that it's pure Eurasian water milfoil that you have. Sometimes the hybrids can look really similar, and that wouldn't, again, probably change the approach that you're taking. It would just be kind of now you know that it is a hybrid. So, yeah.
And then I think in an email you mentioned that was part of a bigger study that's being done in the state.
Yeah. Yes. So there's a map. If you just Google, I think if you Google milfoil mapper, the lab, they're out of Montana State University. They do milfoil genetics. They're like the one lab that does this. They produced this map that actually tracks milfoil genetics throughout the U.S. It's primarily they've done work in the Midwest, but I've sent them samples that they've added to their map. So I think it's kind of just, again, kind of a neat thing because you can see things like it's often the same exact strain of Eurasian water milfoil, the same genotype, genetic strain, however you want to call it, that we find everywhere, which means they're basically clones that people are just bringing around. There's very little genetic diversity. So it also kind of helps you get a picture of, okay, if this strain was found in XYZ lake and now it's found here, well, somebody probably brought it in versus it, just coming up on its own kind of thing. So yeah, I'm going to go with you next and then the gentleman in the back. Yeah, that's a great question. So, it depends on a number of factors, but I think the fact that it's a relatively small infestation, really Procelicor is probably the best product on the market for targeting milfoils. We've seen a lot of success with Eurasian water milfoil with that product. So I think you're about as good of a situation as you can be having it on your lake to be successful. So I think the key would be, it's not necessarily that you need to necessarily treat every year, but just to keep monitoring so that when those come back, you can you can get a treatment in right away. So, and then, ideally you might get down to a time where there's just a couple plants here and there, and maybe you just hand pull those plants or put down some bottom barriers, and you can kind of change your approach. But it seems like now probably the best is using this herbicide product, get that population down, and then you can kind of do spot treatments from there. So I think I'd be optimistic for sure. I think.
That's my question.
Okay. Yeah. Yes.
I was gonna ask, when there are these big mats, like if that got out of hand and was big, is there an association between mats of aquatic plants like that and the algae, the toxic algae at all? I mean, is that?
Not necessarily that I'm aware of. Sometimes what people will see is when there's those surface mats, those will collect like filamentous algae that's not the toxic type, and that it'll get these air bubbles in. It'll look really nasty, but that's not necessarily toxic algae, or they're cyanobacteria or producing those cyanotoxins. So as far as I'm aware, there's not necessarily a direct association between those two. It's more so kind of that nuisance filamentous algae, which you don't really want either, but it's not going to be as harmful as the other type. So good question. Yes.
What's the exact slideshow you did to identify the plants available on a website somewhere, or?
So it's on this computer now, and I think we can make sure that gets shared, whether it's this version or maybe a slightly different version that I make. So yep.
You can have access to it to identify plants.
Yeah, we can get it up on the website. And maybe we'll put it.
It'll be on the YouTube channel for Pattison Lake.
And I did bring a couple, there's some booklets that were provided by King County that has, it's mostly focused on noxious aquatic plants that's there, as well as a pamphlet just on Eurasian Watermilfoil, which has some lookalikes and some nice photos in there too that I brought. So yeah, you can grab some of those. I'm not sure who is next. Maybe, go ahead.
So Class B plant,
Mm-hmm.
but the county, Thurston County doesn't require it to be managed.
Correct.
So we were able to do that because we moved out quickly on it.
Yep.
But is there any resistance, going to be resistance to those treatments?
Absolutely not. No, I think, it's no resistance. It's just a matter of oftentimes with these Class Bs that the county is just like, they only have a handful of staff, right? They're handling terrestrial weeds, aquatics, they're handling so much. So often it's just the case where they say, hey, we can't feasibly address this plant, so we have to undesignate it. So no opposition whatsoever as far as I would be aware of. I think it's just a matter of they don't have the manpower to handle it. So, yeah. I think Jane had a question. Yeah.
Just as far as it going dormant in the winter, when would you expect that it starts to kind of start creeping out in the spring, just given, every year is a little different, water temperature and all that, but.
Yeah, it really depends. It's a little weird. So I came from Minnesota in the Midwest where every lake ice is over, right? You find this in Eastern Washington. So it's very, there's a cutoff, right? Okay, the ice goes off, the lake turns over, the plants start growing. Here it's not as clear cut. So I've seen milfoil kind of just hanging out, sometimes through the winter, sometimes really early in the year it can just be there. But I don't think it's really going to start growing until really May and June is really when it's going to start going, and that obviously is really dependent on the weather and everything too. So that would probably be the kind of safe answer, is late May to June is when it would start going. So a couple questions here.
If this plant is hybridized in the lake, is that going to make management prevention easier or harder?
Well, so I don't suspect that we have hybrids here in the lake. If it did turn out to be a hybrid, I think the good thing is the product that you're currently using, the herbicide, it seems effective on any kind of milfoil. So that wouldn't be a problem there. There are some other products like 2,4-D and fluoridone, which are products that have been around for a long time, which they've actually found some resistance in the hybrids, but those products aren't used as frequently anymore. And again, the product that y'all are implementing here will be effective on hybrids and the pure strains. So yeah. Yes.
Are there temperatures, like what data can we monitor in the lake to know when the milfoil may start growing again?
Yeah.
Or is it kind of like, we think May, April, June, whatever?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Right.
Is there like a temperature that it will kind of?
Yeah, there certainly has been research on that. I don't know off the top of my head, but I can get back to you on that. There's been tons of studies on Eurasian Watermilfoil. So there could be some temperature cutoffs I could get back to you on about what.
There's like stratification, if it's a certain, or you see the lake start to flip, or.
Yeah, it's Yeah, again, I can't think off the top of my head, I mean, what that number is, but there have been some research on that, so I can get back to you on that. It might not, it's so tough, right? Some of those studies are done in the lab, they're done in other states, so it's not always like an exact thing, but I can at least get you some information on that, for sure. I'll take one in the back, I think was in it first.
We've had some that's been treated now.
Yep.
Found and treated.
Mhm.
What is the likelihood of
Well, I think as long as y'all have kind of delineated the current population, it sounds fairly well. It sounds like folks have been in the water doing some work. I mean, I would trust that it's, you know, there's always going to be maybe a little bit more beyond the periphery that you miss, right? Aquatic plants are tough to survey because they get so dense, especially later in the year. So to say that, you know, 100% confident that you found 100% of it, probably not likely, but it sounds like you've done as good a job as possible to delineate that population. So, and certainly the treatments aren't going to, you know, increase that population or the spread. So I would be pretty optimistic that, you know, that you're not going to next year all of a sudden find an explosion of the plants. One thing to keep an eye on is like those fragments. You know, you got lots of eyes out on the lake, right? People out there boating, people living on the lake. You know, sometimes, especially like in the spring or even later in the fall, if there wasn't a treatment, you might see a lot of fragmentation and fragments floating around. So keep an eye on that. And if you're seeing that, you know, you could organize some folks and go out there and collect some fragments, you know, so that's things you can do to help prevent that spread if you're seeing something like that. But given the treatment, I wouldn't expect there to be a lot of that fragmentation. So, yeah. Yes?
So if you put it in your compost pile, like we have eagles and stuff,
Mm.
like do birds like it, will they carry it off back into the lake? Because they throw stuff out of their nest all the time.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I wouldn't expect that. Yeah, that's a good question, though. I don't have much experience with that. I would think you're relatively safe, but again, if you felt like, oh man, the eagles are rooting around in my compost, you know, you could just trash any fragments you see just to be safe. But yeah, that's a good question. Yeah. Yes.
depth? Where do the milfoils like to grow?
Yeah, they can grow up to, 20 feet of water depth. So, I'm not sure. I haven't sampled maybe the deeper areas of Pattison Lake. If you're finding any plants there, milfoil can probably grow to that depth. If you're reaching an area, every lake's different, right? Some at 10 feet, there's no more plants. Some at 5 feet, some at 30 feet. So it can grow relatively deep as probably any of your other native aquatic plant can grow.
It's warm. I mean, we know what's going down at the depth, we measure the oxygen levels, the temperature, so we know those conditions.
Yeah.
But at the shoreline, it's warm.
Sure. Yeah, it's not an exact, like, okay, at certain, XYZ depth or XYZ water temperature. It's usually, it's usually a matter of like sunlight, and it can be relatively tolerant of some of those temperatures too. So it's tough to say. I don't know if you guys have an idea of where you've seen it grow to what depth currently, but usually that's kind of the number I throw out is like up to 20 feet. And
Shallow, it's not.
yeah.
I think it was reported it's anywhere between 8 and 12.
Okay.
Whatever.
Okay. And that's fairly common. I mean, I think that's probably like a happy spot for it. It won't grow in like maybe a couple inches of water, but anywhere from like a foot, down to that. I can imagine it being pretty happy. So, yeah. Okay. Well, maybe that's good. So I'll be sticking around too. So yeah, thank you everyone.